We're super excited to have Dr. Agbai here today. She is an incredible scholar. She's been here at OSU this is her third year, right? So she was started as a postdoc for a year in sociology, and then her second year now as a faculty member in sociology. She comes to us from Brown University with her PhD in sociology, but also has a bachelor's degree in political science, and brings that knowledge and wealth here. She studies racial inequality, housing, but also health and inequality relationships. So just really a tremendous scholar, and we're super excited to have you here. And I'll let you take it away.
Well, thank you so much for that very generous, very kind introduction. Really excited to be here with you all today, sharing some of my ongoing work about the GI Bill and its impacts on various elements of kind of homeownership and wealth inequality, et cetera. But the talk today is titled Wealth Begins at Home, Housing Benefits of the 1944 GI Bill and the Reproduction of the Black-White Inequality in Homeownership. So this work is part of a larger project about the housing benefits of the 1944 GI Bill. And it looks at its impacts on various outcomes, including, what is the effect of this policy on already existing racial inequalities and housing wealth? How is it impacting kind of where people across race live by 1960? And then what are the intergenerational impacts of this policy on housing wealth? So today I'm just going to focus on these first two questions. To what extent was there racial inequality in the implementation of the home loan guarantee of the 1944 GI Bill? And then what was the effect of this policy on these existing inequalities in housing outcomes? So in recent years, there's been kind of an uptick in conversation concerning the racial wealth gap. These are just a few of the kind of more historically focused headlines. The Washington Post article reads, "Why the racial wealth gap persists more than 150 years after emancipation." And even the Harvard Business Review argues it's time for US business owners to talk about reparations. So wealth is one of the most unequally distributed economic resources, as many of you already know. This is just plotting average household net worth by race between 1989 and 2019. And so it kind of graphs this large inequality in net worth for the average household. And so the blue line here is white non-Hispanic households, and then the orange line is Black non-Hispanic, and then the green is kind of Hispanic Latino households. So you can see in plotting from 1989 through 2019, this graph demonstrates that there was already a large kind of inequality in average household net worth, and then this has only increased over time. And so then by 2019, it's more than $800,000. And there's major focus on homeownership in the wealth literature because homeownership is one of the largest assets that American families possess. This is just plotting assets by wealth percentile in 2023 across the wealth distribution. So for most of the distribution, which is kind of the bottom 50th through the 90th percentiles here outlined in red, you can see that real estate, which is the light blue, I believe, yes, the light blue, is the largest asset but for most of the wealth distribution. And so the role of homeownership in the racial wealth gap is very well documented, as many of you know here. There's fewer empirical works elucidating how policy contributed to its creation. So the questions that I'm seeking to answer kind of on the more theoretical side is, what are the empirical implications of historic policies on Black-white inequality and homeownership? And then empirically, I'm asking, to what extent was there racial inequality in the distribution of this policy by 1960, and what was the impact of it on racial inequalities in homeownership and housing? So why are we concerned about this really old policy in 2024? So the home loan guarantee was one of the largest housing policies in American history, costing the federal government about $20 billion in 1956 dollars. But we actually don't know a ton about its effects on racial inequality over time. And it also occurred at a pivotal moment in homeownership and suburbanization. There was already kind of this huge housing shortage during the Great Depression. And then immediately after the Great Depression during World War II, a lot of the energy and effort that would have been used to remedy the shortage and build more housing was directed toward fighting World War II. And so then this comes between 1944 and 1956, and this is a major time of building homes And a lot of the available space to build these neighborhoods was on the edges of urban areas of cities. And so these are the suburbs that are being built at the time. So this is like a really pivotal moment in American home ownership. And the policy itself is very race neutral in language. It doesn't say Black veterans need not apply or anything, but it's believed to have contributed to the contemporary racial wealth gap. A lot of historians kind of cite this policy as something that was really crucial in exacerbating existing wealth inequalities. But we don't have great empirical evidence of what its impacts were and how unequally distributed it actually was, which we'll get into. And then there's the issue of wealth being intergenerational. So a large share of wealth at the household level is inherited from the previous generations. And also children often remain in the same wealth position as their parents. So even though this policy is relatively old, a lot of people's grandparents or parents served in World War II, and so there are still a lot of impacts of this policy today. Okay. So jumping right into what the GI Bill of 1944 was and what it was intended to do. So the purpose of this policy was to ease the transition back into civilian life for returning World War II veterans. And the benefits included tuition and stipend at a veteran's school of choice, or fees for on-the-job training that were covered. And then it also included unemployment compensation and healthcare to injured veterans at no cost. It also offered these US Treasury-backed housing, business, and farm loans. So my focus is on the housing benefits of the 1944 GI Bill, the home loan guarantee. So the home loan guarantee ensured up to 50% of a veteran's home loan, up to $4,000. And just for reference, median home value in 1940 was about $2,900. So just slightly cheaper than it is today. And it was available to World War II veterans who served at least 90 days between September 1940 and July 1947. And you could not have been dishonorably discharged in order to access these benefits, and you could access them through July of 1956. So by June of 1956, 4.5 million home loans had been guaranteed under the policy, costing the federal government nearly $20 billion. And it helped about 42% of veterans become homeowners, while just 34% of non-veterans of comparable ages owned their homes. So for decades, the GI Bill was hailed as a triumph of public policy. In a campaign speech, then Governor Bill Clinton in 1992 said that the GI Bill and the Peace Corps were two of the best ideas the country's ever had. And a joint resolution that was marking the 50th anniversary of the bill argued that it was an unqualified success. So historians argue that there was significant racial inequality in the implementation of the HLG. So about 11% of American soldiers during World War II were Black on average between 1941 and 1945. But existing data suggests that less than 1% of HLG loans went to Black veterans. And so one major source that's often cited that for backing this estimate is anecdotal evidence from an employee of the Veterans Administration at the time. So Geo Holland was an assistant to the Veterans Administration administrator in 1955. And he said, "It is my educated guess that less than 30,000 colored veterans have benefited from the provisions of the GI loan program." So a ton of historical accounts of the GI Bill and how unequally distributed it was are based in part on this estimate from this employee of the Veterans Administration in 1955. And then the other sources of these kind of perceptions of racial inequality and the distribution of this policy come from a small scale survey from 1947 that was fielded by Ebony Magazine. The issue with the survey was that it was very small, and also it happened about 9 years before the end of the policy. So you're not really getting the full view of how unequal it was. And then a lot of the other estimates are also region specific. So they tell you good information about, say, parts of New York and New York suburbs, but not good information about the rest of it. So they're not really national estimates. So these estimates that exist already give us some insight into kind of what the racial inequality and implementation of the policy was, but they're not quite conclusive. And so the question remains, what should we expect about the extent of racial inequality in the HLG in terms of who actually received it and what effects the policy had on housing outcomes? So one reason we might expect racial inequality in the distribution of the HLG is because it was implemented in this racial structure of the United States social system. So Bonilla Silva defines the racial structure as a network of social relations at the social, political, economic, and ideological levels that shape the life chances of the various races. And then this is the source of racial inequality. So Richmond and Garvis argue that economic markets are racial structures, meaning that race and racism shape and are then shaped by each other, by economic markets. So one example of how race and racism structured the real estate market of the mid-20th century, which is the time we're concerned with, was through the use of pro-segregation appraisal standards. So the Federal Housing Administration releases its underwriting manual, which is instructions for real estate professionals about how to value homes, essentially. And in the manual, it institutionalized considerations of race and the valuation of property. So it discouraged realtors, lenders, and builders from introducing non-whites into white neighborhoods in an effort to preserve white property values. Another example of how the HLG is kind of operating in this racialized real estate market is through the exclusion of Black borrowers from credit markets. And this was particularly harmful for returning veterans who were trying to take advantage of the HLG because they had to first go to a lending institution and be approved for a mortgage, and then take that to the Veterans Administration and say, hey, can you essentially co-sign this loan? So, but then if they're barred in general from credit markets or excluded largely from credit markets, then this makes gaining access to these benefits very difficult. And so based on all of this, I'm just hypothesizing that the HLG increased racial inequality in homeownership and value. So all of these historical forces are responsible in large part for the contemporary homeownership gap. So about 42% of Black households, 48% of Black households, and 73% of white families own their own homes. And not only is there this inequality in who owns homes, but also in the returns to homeownership. So the returns to homeownership are about a third or about half that of whites. And for Latinx families, about 3/5 of whites. And so mortgages are also more likely to become financial burdens for Black families due to discriminatory and predatory lending practices. So just to remind everyone, we're wondering, what is the extent of racial inequality in the distribution of the home loan guarantee of the 1944 GI Bill, and how did it impact racial inequalities in home ownership and home value? Okay, so the data for this study comes from US Census data, 1960 IPUMS, the 1% sample of the full count decennial census in 1960. And the sample is men ages 18 to 64, because we're thinking about veterans, people who fought in World War II, and they were overwhelmingly male. And then it also uses administrative data from the Veterans Administration, which provides annual counts of the number of home loans guaranteed under the HLG by race by year for the duration of the World War II iteration of the GI Bill between 1944 and 1956. And then I also use 1950 Census of Housing to look at kind of regional variation in the implementation of the policy. And it gives counts of HLG loans distributed in the 25 largest metro areas that were sampled in the Census of Housing in 1950. So the outcome variables are first probability of owning a home, and then separately home value. And the independent variable of interest is veteran status, which we'll talk more about in a moment. And then pretty standard control variables, income, marital status, employment, educational attainment, age, etc. And so the analytic strategy I use is in about 2 parts. So first, to determine the extent of racial inequality and the distribution of HLG receipts, I compare the percent of HLG loans that went to white and Black veterans compared to the representation in the military. And then second, to estimate kind of the impacts of the policy on racial inequality and homeownership, I employ 2-stage least squares using an instrumental variable. And the IV approach is preferable to OLS because it adjusts for selection into veteran status, which we'll talk more about in a second, And then it also, the estimates are causal if these assumptions are met. And we can, very happy to talk more about some of the assumptions during Q&A if people are interested. Okay, so in this study, I used 1960 veteran status as a proxy for receiving the HLG because I have, the data that I have gives aggregate counts by race, by year of which groups are receiving the HLG, and then the IPUMS data gives individual data, but there's no indicator of like, yes, this person received the HLG. That would be ideal data. And I'm actually trying to work on that, on getting that in a different project, which we can talk about separately. But in this study, I'm using 1960 veteran status as a proxy for receiving HLG. So this, the HLG. So this results in conservative estimates of the effect of this policy because the people, not all veterans received it. And so the veterans who did not receive it, who are still in the sample, are kind of diluting the effects. So these are more conservative estimates. And then concerning selection into World War II military service. So military service was not random, even though about 2/3 of World War II soldiers were drafted into the military because they had to take these various kinds of tests of physical ability and cognitive capacity. So it's not just like a random sample of men between 18 and 64 in the population who were selected. They kind of were selected by having to take these. They were first randomly selected and then they had to take these tests, and not all of them were automatically admitted into the ranks. So there's all of this selection into veteran status. And so that's what I'm trying to use IV two-stage least squares for, to adjust for some of the bias that would come up with using more simple linear regression strategies. So IV two-stage least squares, this method deploys a series of equations to generate causal estimates that account for the various kinds of bias that using more straightforward linear approaches would allow for. And so the idea of this analysis is the birth year window, which is a binary variable that's indicating birth in the 1917 to 1927 birth cohorts. So these people are assigned to 1 and then 0 otherwise. And these cohorts had the largest percentage of World War II veterans born in these cohorts, with the peak in 1922. So that's why they're selected. And they're about 33 to 43 years old in 1916. But one assumption of this method is that the birth window is directly correlated with veteran status, but uncorrelated with housing outcomes. So I'm going to present results in terms of the relative inequality and also absolute inequality, because both are very present in the wealth literature, and they both have pros and cons, which we, you can decide which estimates you like better of inequality. So the relative inequality measures racial inequality in housing wealth in terms of comparative advantage and disadvantage, and it's operationalized as the Black divided by white ratio. And the pros of this measure are that it indicates relative power differentials. And then for absolute inequality, it measures racial inequality and housing wealth in terms of the difference in advantage and disadvantage, and is operationalized as the white minus Black difference. And the pros, one of the pros is that it quantifies opportunity and size of household safety net, or the difference in opportunity and size of household. Okay, so this is a descriptive figure where I plot the percent of loans issued under the HLG to different groups across race, and also the Black and white representation in the military. So you can see white veterans, so white men are here, and that in green, and Black men are in the purple. So you can see that white men are 87% of the military, but they received 94% of HLG loans. And then Black men are 11% of the military, but then received just 5% of HLG loans. So there's whites are clearly overrepresented among recipients of this policy descriptively. And then if you take a look at the regional variation in racial inequality and implementation, this is just mapping VA-backed loans granted to white applicants in the 25 metropolitan areas that were included in the 1950s Census of Housing. So ratios at 1 represent kind of equal representation in terms of white VA loans divided by the percent of white veterans in that metropolitan area. So if it's 1, that's perfectly representative. If it's greater than one, whites are overrepresented in the area. Less than one, other groups or whites are underrepresented in the area, essentially. So a deeper blue you can see is more unequal. So pretty much throughout the US, in most places, whites are overrepresented in terms of who's receiving the benefits of the home loan guarantee. So except for, this is Pittsburgh, where whites are almost kind of perfectly represented in terms of who is receiving these benefits relative to their population in that area. And then kind of the most unequally distributed area, this is New Orleans, where whites are essentially way overrepresented in terms of who's receiving the benefits of the 1944 GI Bill in housing. So this is just a coefficients plot of the effect of the home loan guarantee on homeownership compared to same race non-veterans with 95% confidence intervals based on the IB estimates that I had described earlier. So the full sample is these gray circles, and then white men is the green square, black men is the purple diamond. So you can see that in the full sample, the veterans are about 16 percentage points more likely to be homeowners relative to non-veterans. And same for white men, this is white veterans compared to white non-veterans. And then for black men, they're about 18 percentage points more likely to own homes compared to black non-veterans. But the differences between these estimates is not statistically significant. Okay, so this is the same setup, but now the outcome is home value. So you can see here that for white men in the green square, their homes are, the homes of white veterans are about 5% more, are valued 5% more highly relative to white non-veterans. And for black veterans, it's about 14% relative to black non-veterans. So these are kind of the estimates for the effects of the policy relative to non-veterans of the same race. So then if we turn to predicted values, this figure is plotting IB estimates of the effect of the HLG on the predicted probability of homeownership by 1960. So white men are in the green, is this blue too? I think it's more blue. So white men are in the blue, and then black men are in the lavender. And you can see that for veterans, for white veterans, the predicted probability of homeownership is about 76%. And then for black veterans, 52%. And then if you look at non-veterans, for white, it's lower for both groups. So 56% for white veterans, and about 35% for 56% for white non-veterans, 35% for black veterans. But then what about inequality? So if we look at relative racial inequality first, which is the black divided by white ratio of the predicted probability of homeownership. So values closer to 1 indicate more equal, and then further away from 1 are kind of less or more unequal. So the black divided by white ratio among veterans is 0.68, and then among non-veterans 0.63. And so seeing this, you would think, okay, so in terms of relative inequality, the HLG is contributing to less relative racial inequality, because there's kind of this value of 0.68 is more close to 1 than it is among non-veterans. But then if you look at absolute inequality, or the white minus black difference, then you see a difference of 24 percentage points versus a difference of 21 percentage points. And these differences are statistically significant. So then on the one hand, you have kind of the policy contributing to greater equality in terms of relative inequality, but then more inequality in terms of absolute inequality. So what do we make of this? Which we'll get more into later. But then if we look at kind of the same setup for predicted home value by 1960, for veterans, these are all based on IB estimates. Veterans predicted home value for white men is about $114,000. And then for black veterans, it's about $68,600. And then again, lower for non-veterans. So for white non-veterans, it's about $97,400, and for black non-veterans, about $54,000 or so. And then if we look at the racial inequality, we'll do relative first. For among veterans, racial inequality is 0.6. Among non-veterans, 0.56. So again, it's seeming like, okay, it's contributing, the policy is contributing to lower relative racial inequality. And then again, for absolute inequality, for veterans, the difference is about 45,300. And for non-veterans, the difference is a bit smaller at 42,800 or so. So again, contributing to greater absolute inequality. So to summarize what we've seen so far, there's significant racial inequality in who receives the home loan guarantee, and it increases the probability of home ownership and home value for recipients compared to same race non-veterans. And the results are essentially equal across race, or not statistically distinguishable. And then for recipients, the HLG results in lower relative racial wealth inequality in terms of home ownership and greater absolute inequality in housing values. So then what does this mean at the broader population level? So far we've been looking at kind of the relatively narrow questions of predicted values for veterans versus non-veterans, but then there are also racial inequalities in terms of who is enlisting in the military, SES across race, et cetera. So how do racial inequalities in the probability of receiving the HLG and differential impacts of the policy on housing outcomes compound to impact the amount of home value that the policy contributes to veteran households at the broader population? So to get at this, we need to look at racial differences in the share of men of the right age who were eligible to serve in World War II, the share of men who became homeowners as a result of the HLG, predicted probability of home ownership, and also predicted home value, which we just looked at. So we'd have to kind of take into account all of these things to better understand, what percent of the population of men in the sample, what percent of them did the HLG contribute to their home ownership, and then what was the broader population kind of estimates of how much the policy contributed to their home value. So when we do this, we find that the policy kind of contributed to 7% of Black men becoming homeowners and 13% of white men becoming homeowners. And then if you look at, based on all of these things and the predicted values that we looked at and the differences in probability of home ownership and taking into account differences in veteran status across race, et cetera. And then you come up with, home value per veteran as a result of the HLG by 1960. For Black men, it's contributing about $36,000. And for white men, it's contributing about $87,000 on average for the per veteran. And so then if you bring these estimates from 1960 forward to 2023 at like a 3% annual increase per year, by 2023, this would be about $230,000 for Black men and $557,000 for white men on per veteran on average in 2023 at a 3% annual increase. So that's a difference of about $328,000 or so. So the population estimates take into account a bunch of different factors that we just discussed, but how influential are each of these different factors? So to try to isolate, how important it is that white men were veterans at higher rates versus differences in SES, et cetera. I use these counterfactual scenarios to essentially give Black and white men the same values on one thing at a time to see which thing is really most contributing to these inequalities that we see. So the first way to try to get this is to see if it's racial inequalities in veteran status in the first place that are contributing to the white minus Black inequality in home value per veteran. So if you set the share of Black World War II veterans to that of white veterans, which is about 18%, there's no real impact on inequality in terms of the difference in per veteran home value at the population level. So it doesn't seem like that's the culprit here. And then if you look at if you think about the differences in SES and you set Black SES to white SES, so the same kind of distribution of income, education, and employment, this also doesn't really impact inequality, which there are probably a lot of reasons for, but we can talk more about during Q&A just for time, if people are interested. And then if you kind of set the predicted home ownership for Black veterans to that of whites, which we looked at earlier, that would be about 76% for both groups, Then you see a 32% decline in inequality in terms of per veteran home value. And then if you look at the predicted home value for Black veterans, and you set that to that of whites at about $114,000, this results in kind of a 46% decline in inequality and per veteran home value at the population level. So, and so for each of these steps, you're kind of keeping everything else the same. So first, you just set the share of Black World War II veterans to that of whites, everything else equal. Same for the rest of the three. So it seems like, you know, it's the differences in predicted home value and predicted home ownership that are really making a big difference in terms of the inequality at the population level. Okay. So, you know, why do we care about this? So as I already mentioned, you know, wealth is kind of intergenerational. So a lot of the wealth that was acquired in previous generations is just, you know, being passed down in large part to their descendants. And so in terms of generational time, 80 years is not a huge difference, or a very long time ago, essentially. And then this also shows us that, you know, as everyone knows, this in a policy school, you all know that policy can be very effective in increasing wealth, but then equal access across race is imperative for these kinds of, if you're working towards inequality or equality. And then results shed light on the extent to which race-neutral policies exacerbate racial inequality in the US racialized social system in different domains, from Medicaid expansion to the HUD Act of 1968 to the mortgage interest deduction, et cetera. And so this study just raises questions. I mean, so for example, what are the mechanisms driving these results? Is it that Black veterans were denied when they applied for a mortgage, so they were kind of out of the process at that initial step? Or were they approved for mortgages, but then they would take it to the local Veterans Administration, who then refused to co-sign the mortgage, perhaps? Or were they deterred from applying in the first place because of the broader kind of racially violent society that they're living in? So they just thought, let me, you know, not risk my life for this. So, you know, though it could have been any point in the process. And then what is the source of regional variation? Why is it so different in New Orleans versus Pittsburgh? And then to what extent does the HLG contribute to home ownership in cities versus suburbs? So you think about restrictive covenants that sometimes would bar Black homeowners from, or would-be homeowners from living in an entire suburb, you know, where is that in this formulation in the study? Thank you so much. Looking forward to Q&A.
We'll open it up now on the floor for questions.
Thank you very much for sending your very interesting. I had a question about the decomposition you did, and it's maybe kind of a technical question, but I'm trying to understand how, so the probability of being a veteran is what kind of feeds into your predictive probabilities of home ownership and home value. And so I'm not quite understanding how you can find no effect of the veteran status, but then find effects of the other two. So maybe you can just expound a little bit more on what you did there.
Sure, yeah. So let me go back to those. Let's see, be on the same page. Where are we? Okay. Okay, so, right, veteran status. So this is kind of a newer part of my analysis that I've been thinking through. So I'll definitely take any kind of input anybody has. But essentially, I'm looking at, okay, first of all, what in general in the sample, you know, what's the share of men who were the right age in the first place, and then of them, you know, who are actually veterans in the sample. And so I'm also a bit confused about why I'm not seeing a lot of difference from kind of differential share in veteran status. The thing is, I think that there is just so much going on in terms of kind of the broader structure in which all these veterans and non-veterans were trying to buy, or these veterans in particular, are trying to buy homes. So you have to contend with the issue. And this kind of goes into also why there are not huge differences across SES. Or why, you know, why is there no statistical difference when you kind of set SES at the individual level to be the same across race? I think it's just that if you think about the broader structure, you have to deal with the fact of redlining. You have to deal with these issues of, restrictive covenants, keeping an entire neighborhood from Black would-be homebuyers. So there are just these much broader issues that then dwarf these individual level kinds of considerations. And so that's kind of how I'm thinking about it right now, but very interested in if you have further comments.
Well, I think if I'm understanding correctly, your predicted probabilities come from your IB, right? And so the IB is the generational differences. So I wonder if you could do another decomposition exercise where you set the kind of birth or generational trajectories equal across the two sets of men, and then look to see, like on that, you should definitely get a difference because that's where your variation is coming from.
Okay, what do you mean the generational trajectories, like using a different?
Well, it's in that cohort that you're kind of using as the idea of being more likely. So if that varies across race, that's kind of where some of your racial differences are coming from in the prediction, in your predicted probability and value.
Okay, yeah.
So just as kind of a test for yourself, of, like, I know this is what is, leading into my predictions, I can then really just actively test how much is this generational differences or, demographic differences in birth patterns across races.
Sure, yeah, that's a great idea. Thank you so much. Yes.
It's a little in the weeds about military composition at the time, but you mentioned some of the sort of criteria for military service for this cohort that you're looking at. And there were, said like physical tests, of course, and some sort of like intellectual test or whatever. God only knows how that was done. But so were there surprising differences in Black versus white enlistment or enrollment in the military?
Sure, yeah. So I get, the day I'm looking at is by 1960. So we're looking at veterans. In terms of enlistment, I would need to dive more into, but there definitely are differences in terms of veteran status by 1960. And there are a lot of things could have happened to result in that. There could have been differences in enlistment in the first place. There could have been differences in mortality across race during the war, which I think, kind of based on the historical accounts that a lot of Black men in the military wanted more substantial assignments and not being assigned like the cook for the camp or, these kinds of more menial tasks and less kind of upfront military combat. So there's some conversation about the fact that Black men in the military were relegated to those kinds of roles. So I don't know that there would be higher mortality for Black men once they were already enlisted, but whatever the case. But by the time you get to veteran status in 1960, it was about 13% of Black men at the right ages were veterans and about 17% of white men. So there is some difference, not a huge difference, but definitely existing.
I was really interested in the regional heterogeneity you showed, and it looks like that was in the ratios, right? Yes. So, but what about like the overall, once you take it to the population level, do you see heterogeneity there too, where? In terms of not check, I'm just curious if there's like, does this trickle down? Then I would assume it does, but because that's like an interesting story then that maybe could help you kind of tease out the mechanisms, if you're not seeing it in certain northern areas, but you are seeing it in other areas.
Okay, so you're saying if I looked at the kind of raw numbers of like, what number of HLG loans went to this group versus the other group versus the populate, like I'm trying to understand.
Yeah, we're just getting to the end when you do your population simulations at the end, like have you run those separately for different areas of the country?
Okay, no, I haven't. Those are all kind of aggregate national.
Yeah.
Okay, that's a very good point, thinking more about integrating the differences across, or some places just, there's a high uptake of the HLG versus.
Right, maybe that could help tease out some of these, sort of an alternative to, or in addition to the decomposition that you're doing,
Yeah, cool, that's a great idea, thank you so much. Yes.
I'm intrigued by your future research and particularly the data source, like availability of data sources for things like, did they apply for a mortgage and get denied at the various gates of VA? Like, do those administrative records exist, or is that's something that is kind of fascinating to me?
Yeah, no, me, to me as well. Thank you for this question. Yeah, so in terms of, there's not HMDA data from 1940, unfortunately. So for that, I would need to do a lot of thinking about what kinds of data I could cobble together. And if anybody has any thoughts about this, please let me know. But in terms of kind of the intergenerational effects of the policy and getting better data about who exactly received these benefits, working with some colleagues at Michigan who have this sample of veterans who received the home loan guarantee, and it has, their names, addresses, and then we're linking it to census data. So then, we're gonna, when that's linked, I think we're just gonna go nuts with it. So then that will be kind of more of the intergenerational, that'll get to the more intergenerational elements. But in terms of like, did you apply for a mortgage and then not get accepted? This would have to be probably archival research, I think. I don't think right now administrative data. But if anybody knows of any, please alert me. Yes.
Well, kind of along the same lines, is there a difference in who was eligible? Like, was there a racial difference in who was dishonorably discharged, for example? Or what, and also, was there a difference in how the information was shared with veterans that they are eligible for these benefits? So is there a possibility that white veterans just had more access to knowledge about this benefit?
Yeah, thank you. These are great questions. In terms of, kind of racial differences in marketing for the GI. So it was very well known, like it was a lot of the magazines, I'm trying to remember which magazine, the NAACP comes out and they say like, this is going to be so great for Black veterans, et cetera, et cetera. So that kind of indicates that it's well publicized, that the NAACP is making these kind of public declarations about it and then being relatively disappointed there in the next few years. And then in terms of, oh yes, racial inequality in dishonorably discharged. Yes, that definitely exists. I'm trying to think of how I would get to that in this. I would have to just probably use estimates from, because the thing is, I don't know if that data is kind of publicly, if there's administrative data that says this percent of, or the Black veterans or this, or Black men in the military, this percent more likely to be dishonorably discharged. I looked into it a bit when I first started on this and didn't find anything, but that was a couple of years ago. So there might be more out now, so I'll definitely look again, but thank you.
I'm just curious about like policy, thinking about the implications of this for policy. So on one hand, it sounds like a story is that this could exacerbate racial inequalities. On the other hand, like absent this, would it have been worse? Like, do we know, would racial inequality and homeownership, mortgage and wealth be worse absent this? Or did this make it, like, I'm trying to pick at that in my brain and yeah.
Yeah, I think like it definitely contributed to kind of, in terms of relative inequalities, it seems like it's shrinking it a little bit over time, but then at the same time, on the absolute, at the broader population level, would it be worse without this? That's a good question. I would say that this, I mean, a lot for the Black veterans who were able to access this, it was like a windfall, like a huge, I mean, it increased their home value a lot. It increased their predicted probability of owning a home in the first place a ton. So I'm not really saying like this was we should get rid of this policy, like it shouldn't have been there in the first place, but more of just like, if you even look kind of more narrowly at the people who did receive it, in terms of Black veterans, it did a lot for them and their ability to accumulate wealth, et cetera, but at the same time, it's still exacerbating these inequalities. So it is kind of complex. It's not very clean, like this was a bad policy. It's more, if it were distributed in a more equal way, but then it's also laid on top of this kind of racialized social structure where the homes of Black veterans are valued much lower and you have to deal with redlining and all these things. Yeah, it still kind of increases. So yeah, I'm thinking about how to kind of frame, if I were to talk to policymakers about this kind of thing, I would have to think a lot about how to present policy, and especially for more contemporary policies, like working on a paper about the mortgage interest deduction and thinking about like, how is it contributing to inequality and wealth over time? And it's like, okay, well, in terms of what do policymakers do, how should they address it? I think there are so many issues underlying, like even if it were distributed equally, the fact that you know, home values, the way that Black homes are undervalued relative to white homes, even if you control for a ton of different things. You know, it's not only the policy, it's also kind of, you know, people hate sociologists for this reason. Or like the social structures are really the problem. And they are, but, so it's hard for policymakers to then come in and work within the system that we already have, how there would then be a very, a bill or a policy that could uproot these inequalities. It would have to be just targeted toward like Black veterans.
Yeah.
It couldn't be like, oh, Black and white, but it would have to be like this policy.
Yeah.
But then, of course, that's not politically feasible. So, yeah, sorry, these are unsatisfying answers, yes.
A weird question. If you were able to go back in time with the knowledge you have now, and in some kind of weird way, you had some influence over how this policy would be implemented, with all of the social structures, all of the different things that you know as barriers, what could have been some possibly successful, like, loophole, like going around, you know, kind of ways of increasing the amount of Black veterans that took advantage of the benefit?
Let's see, that's a great question. What would to increase the amount of veterans who take advantage of it? Okay, let's see. I think. Okay. You have to find a lender that's willing to lend to Black people in the area that you're in. Or you'd have to move. Okay, either one, you either find a lender in the area that you live. So let's say you're not moving. You live in New Orleans. Okay, you have to find the lender. You have to all get together in a meeting and say, who has bought a house recently? What was your lender? Okay, and so that's the first thing. Then you have to deal with the local Veterans Administration. So you have to somehow find the one person, the 10 Black people in the New Orleans metro, or whatever, 2,150 people in the New Orleans metro area who took advantage of the GI Bill and say, wait, the thing is, there's only one local Veterans Administration. So you have to say, who was working when you went to the local Veterans Administration? What did you do to get them to co-sign the loan, et cetera? So then there's that. Then you have to find the neighborhood with the highest home values where Black people could live. So, you know, the thing is that eliminates the most highly valued neighborhoods because of all of these numerous reasons that we already talked about. Whatever the case, dealing with what you're dealing with, you have to find the neighborhood with the highest Black home values. But then if you can't afford it, that's a separate problem. But say you can afford it. You have to do that and then find the realtor who will sell it to you in that neighborhood. So you just somehow collectively all get together and exchange notes about what's going on and what effect would that have? But I think those are the things that would need to be done to start.
Because it makes me wonder about just, I mean, you have this happening within, kind of like within the Great Migration.
Yeah.
And so I wonder how much this could have influenced, like, what contribution does this possibly have to the Great Migration, especially for families living in the South where it was, yeah, in order to take advantage of this, I'm probably gonna have to move up.
Interesting. You're thinking like the fact that like returning veterans get back to the South and then they realize they can't take advantage of these policies, whether that was another of the push factors to kind of, that's very possible. There are definitely, I mean, there are a lot of arguments made about how people who, like Black veterans who returned from World War II and then kind of realized their lack of rights still in the US after risking everything for this country, that was kind of a major catalyst of the civil rights movement. So it might have also contributed to the Great Migration for sure. That's a really good point. Yes.
One thing I think was skipped over really quickly is the training and education benefit.
Mhm.
And that enabled people, the veterans who took advantage of that were in better position to buy a home.
Mhm.
And I'm thinking of my father-in-law. My father-in-law was in World War II and he was the youngest boy on a dairy farm in central Wisconsin. So he wasn't gonna inherit any land. So, he didn't have a lot of job prospects, but he served, he returned, he was able to get electronics, training to be an electrician in Chicago. And so he moved to Chicago and he got a really, really good job because he had this training, and then he could afford to buy a house in Chicago. So, I think that training, the people were able to take advantage of the training, were in a better position to buy a home. And, that's a little side element that you also might want to look into.
I know, that's a great point. I was concerned about that also. In one of the robustness checks, I look at only people who have high school or less. But then, of course, if people were trained in high school, that's unlikely though, because of the cutoff age for veterans, or for serving in the military. So I look only at people whose education is high school or less, so nothing beyond high school. And the results are pretty similar even with that. So I did try to account for that, but that is a very good point because, yeah, there are a lot of things wrapped up in the GI Bill. If you're able to buy a house, that might be because you were able to go to college and get a job that's more highly paying, and then you could get a house. So
He didn't go to college, right out of high school, and then he was able to get the vocational training, because the benefit was not just for college, it was also for vocational training. He was able to get that, so he was able to get, a trade job, which in Chicago, that with all the, unions and everything, he was really making a pretty great salary without a college degree.
Yeah.
So I think that's an element that can impact home ownership.
for sure, yeah, and I'll go back and look at the way that the education variable is coded in 1960 IPUMs and see if for high school only, I think that doesn't include any additional vocational training, but I will double check. Yeah, thank you. Yes.
Building a little bit on what Todd's question earlier, that I was wondering about in the north as well, the preponderance in some of those communities of Black-owned banks, when you were talking about lenders. Because again, if I'm wondering if Pittsburgh, or I think Minneapolis was one of the lighter colored areas, and just in terms of the availability of lenders, if that was a contextual factor or something that you could track in terms of if they're a Black-owned bank.
That is very interesting. Yeah, I had not thought of that, but I will definitely look and see what kind of data there are about, the prevalence of Black-owned banks in an area and whether you can. Okay, yeah, thank you.
Yes, other final comments or questions?
Sorry, so building on the idea that you proposed, when you saw that difference in home value, was that linked at all to where the homes were located? Like, were some of the veteran homes more in like the yellow lined areas instead of the red lined areas? And then if there was a difference in north versus south, because as we know, the homes in the yellow lined areas would have been, they have a greater value today than the homes that were in the red lined areas. So the impact on generational wealth would be different based on where the house was.
Right, yes.
Not just the value of it, but where the house itself was located.
Sure, yeah, so that would have to be more fine-grained geographic data. And the individual data I have, the best geography is at the state level, so that's not great. But in this other kind of project I'm working on, we have addresses, so then we can do some things. Yeah.
All right, well, join me in thanking Dr. Agbai. And if all students want to stick around for 10 minutes or so.